Before we get started, I am going to go into a little bit of context about Ohio. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Ohio measures attendance in hours and not actual days. Ohio is also a local control state, so each district determines the number of hours that they're going to put in for a school day. Districts are required to provide 910 hours of instruction for students in grade K to 6, provided that the K student is a full-time student, and then 1,001 hours for students in grades 7 to 12. Our community schools are a little different. They are required to be open for instruction for a minimum of 920 hours, and that's for all students in grades K to 12. Ohio does have a definition for chronic absenteeism, and it's defined as missing 10% of the school year for any reason. So for most districts in Ohio, that's about 18 days. We obviously want to encourage schools and districts to provide any supports possible to students and their families before they miss that 10% of the year. Some attendance definitions that Ohio uses: we have what's called excessively absent. Excessively absent is a student who is out of school, whether it be excused or unexcused for any reason except medical. And those hours would be 38 hours in a month or 65 hours in a year. We also have habitually truant, and this is a little more intensive, and it does require some additional interventions for students. And a habitually truant student is absent with an unexcused absence for 30 consecutive hours, 42 hours in a month, or 72 hours in a school year. And a student who's habitually truant gets assigned to an absence intervention team in the school. And it's usually made up of somebody who has a strong connection to the student, a school administrator, and of course, the most important piece is a parent or guardian. They work together to identify barriers and concerns for attendance. And in return, they create an absence intervention plan. And students have 60 days to show improvement on that plan before they would be considered for any kind of truancy charge in a juvenile court. Next slide, please. I am going to talk about some impacts that COVID-19 had on Ohio. We know that this has been an impact for everybody. The numbers that I have here came from the Department of Health, and they were as current as March 3rd, 2022. But as you can see, this is the numbers reported. We had 201,000 students who ended up testing positive for COVID, and we had almost 43,000 staff. So as a result, there were a lot of schools that had to shut down for several days, possibly a week. They had to move into a remote setting, whatever they could to try and keep education going. But unfortunately, sometimes it could not occur. Ohio also saw a huge increase in homeschool students, and these are not an online community school. These are actually numbers of students who are receiving home instruction. And as you can see, in 2021, we were at 33,000. And then this year, we jumped up to 51,000. So a lot of these students are going to be looking to come back to their district potentially as COVID, knock on wood, slows down a little bit. So schools are going to need to be prepared for that. Good news is that schools have only reported 770 new cases of COVID on March 3rd. So we are definitely seeing a major decline in COVID. And these are the fewest amount of cases since school started back in late August, early September. Next slide. Thank you. As Hetty had mentioned, prior data is very important because it is a very strong indicator on what attendance could look like for the upcoming year. Ohio does not collect attendance data until the end of the school year. So we have to rely on districts that are willing to share their numbers with us to get some data, and then also some of our partners, which I'll be talking about a little later on in the presentation. We also use 2018, 2019 data as kind of a baseline because that was the most consistent year that we've had since the pandemic started. And as you can see in 2021 versus 18-19, we've had major increases in chronic absenteeism, especially in our urban and major urban districts and also our community schools. Next slide, please.
Brian, can I just make a comment? Because I think part of the legend went away, I don't know, in the formatting. So the crosshatch here, that's the 18-19 data, right? And then the other data is the 2021 data. I just wanted to make sure people understood that.
Yes, you are absolutely correct. Thank you for that, Hetty. The other thing I want to go into a little bit is our grade level data. Traditionally, what we saw in Ohio was in the elementary grades, kindergarten would traditionally be the highest for chronic absenteeism. Then you would see a dip down, and then it would start to peak back up a little bit around 8th to 9th grade. But as you can see here, as a result of the pandemic, we had major increases in our middle school grades, our 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. And that's a big concern for us because those are the key grades before students move into high school. So if they're lacking their foundational skills, it's going to be a challenge to get them caught back up. Next slide. One of our partners is Proving Ground at Harvard University, and they work with multiple districts, both urban and rural. I asked them to pull some of their urban data for this year. So there's 3 schools that are involved here with their urban data. And just like we had talked about with the previous slides, we are seeing a continued increase in chronic absenteeism in our urban districts. Hetty had mentioned previously, just in a discussion about how Ohio has continuously increased. And that's going to be a challenge for our districts to get our students to come back to school, to feel safe, to feel that they are respected in their environments. So there's going to be a lot of work ahead of us. Next slide. As we can also see in 2021, 2022 school year, chronic absenteeism continues to rise. We are seeing, again, that rise in our middle schools, which can be concerning, and not as much as the high school. The high school maybe has plateaued a little bit. But where a big concern for Ohio right now is our elementary schools, because what you see here is very similar to other districts that have submitted data to the Department of Education. We're seeing major increases in chronic absenteeism in our elementary schools. Next slide. We can also see here, it's the grade levels, similar to what we saw in 2020, 2021. We're seeing the increase, but the dip is starting to level off a little bit at our grades 7 and 8. But our high school now has increased greatly in these 3 urban districts. And we want to make sure that we are putting programs in place to help our high school students. There's multiple ways in Ohio to receive a high school diploma, and we want to make sure that all of our students have opportunities to do that. Next slide. The other thing that we're going to look at is our demographics. And as you can see here, that it is not just impacting one demographic group, it is impacting everybody in these 3 districts. Where our major concerns are, again, is the huge jump that we had from 2019 to 2020 and the continuation into 21, 22, especially for our white students, our Hispanic students, and our multi-race students. Next slide. In order to help all of our districts, Ohio created Senate Bill 229. And this went into effect on December 14th, 2021. Chronic absenteeism is a measure on Ohio's report cards for districts and for schools. Just to ease their minds a little bit, that has been removed off the report card for this year, but should be reinstated for the 22-23 school year. We also wanted this bill to make sure that districts had flexibility to keep education going. That was a big challenge for a lot of our districts. At the beginning of the year, when we didn't know the impact that Delta and Omicron was going to have on our schools, a lot of people anticipated returning to in-person learning and creating mask policies. As we saw, the numbers greatly increased, and students were still required to come in if the district didn't put in an online learning program or a blended learning program. The Senate Bill 229 allowed them to do that. We also know the impact that our students are seeing with social, emotional, and mental health concerns. And schools were not using telehealth as part of the therapy for these students. And this bill allows that to continue through the 21-22 school year. The other thing that this bill addresses is a loss of learning. We know that students have had a loss of learning, and we want to make sure that schools are prepared to support families and students in the summertime. So schools and districts are required to create a plan to identify the loss of learning and what they can do to support the families and students to make up for that lost time. Next slide. Ohio has what we call the Stay in the Game Network. It's a unique partnership between the Cleveland Browns Foundation, the Ohio Department of Education, and Proving Ground at Harvard. We collaborate weekly with a goal in the back of our minds to reduce chronic absenteeism by 50% over the next 10 years. We recognize that that's going to be a challenge, especially as we do our attendance recovery, but we are still going to focus on that goal. Ohio's legislation also required the Stay in the Game Network to identify programs that can use ESSER funding to support districts and provide attendance recovery for families and students. Next slide. The Cleveland Browns Foundation works with multiple districts across Ohio, and there's various levels of opportunities for these districts to participate. We have learning districts, we have planning districts, and then we also have action districts. Our planning districts and our action districts have access to a digital campaign playbook. And the playbook is good for identifying root causes and what can be done to create an attendance campaign, which is really a tier 1 intervention for schools. We want to enhance that so districts have the opportunity to see more data and receive additional support when they're discussing their numbers, and be able to promote various activities that come through with the Cleveland Browns. As an example, players and coaches and Chomps, the mascot, will occasionally visit schools to help provide a little boost to encourage students to come to school on a regular basis. We also want to make sure that the Stay in the Game campaign has multiple opportunities for other districts. So we want to make sure that we're not capped at the number of districts that we can support. And that ties into the hiring of an executive director. They want to make sure that the executive director can carry out the mission of the Stay in the Game Network and be a close contact for districts that are participating. Next slide. I discussed a little bit of work that we're doing with Proving Ground. We look to enhance that relationship with Proving Ground. We are going to work with 4 to 6 districts that have over 7,500 students or a possible targeted demographic to identify their data, to put interventions in, to see what works in their district and what does not. We also want to make sure that districts understand that when they are planning, that they can do interventions that will be successful and eliminate the ones that are not. And then finally, we want to make sure that they're able to use their data to make positive outcome maximizing decisions when thinking about interventions. Next slide. We also are going to be doing some work with Attendance Works. Attendance Works is going to come into districts and they're going to create a diagnostic, which is going to be about 5 to 6 months of real intensive root cause analysis, figuring out what is going on and what supports are needed to help create a positive attendance program in the district. They also are going to work with the Ohio Department of Education and the Stay in the Game Network to provide professional development opportunities for our districts. And then they'll work with districts to provide district-focused professional development based on their needs. Next slide. We also partnered with Graduation Alliance. Engage Ohio is going to be an attendance recovery program that we have. This is available to everybody in the state, including community schools and private schools. It's going to be available for students in grades K to 12. And really what we're trying to do is find those students that have been out of school, got lost in the shuffle, maybe were close to graduating and then never returned to school, and help them to get their diplomas. But ultimately, districts will opt in. They'll receive coaching support from Engage Ohio. That data gets sent back to the district, and then families will find success. Next page. The department also has really put an emphasis on being proactive with attendance versus being reactive. So we identified multiple tools that districts and schools can use to help support attendance and also have families believe they are part of the solution and that they're not part of the problem. Next slide, please. I tell everybody, whenever you're in doubt, please reach out. This will be my contact information. If there's anything that you saw today that you have questions about or ideas that you would like to discuss with me, please do not hesitate to give my office a call, my cell a call, or shoot me an email. And with that, Hetty, I'm going to turn it back to you.